Welcome back to Porterverse Workbench. For this episode, we'll be covering one of the famous 8 engines. We will finally be discussing my model of Percy the smol engine. Now, if you're a veteran of this channel, props to you by the way, you'll know that Percy is a model that I originally made way back in late 2021 and early 2022, when I was first getting into modeling trains. I think it was actually the first model I made. A simple repaint of Hornby's pocket rockets. Wasn't really anything special, but it did pave the way to, well, all of this. That model has long since been dismantled. But now we have this beauty of a model right before us. Before we get into how I made the model itself, let's dive into Percy's Porterverse backstory. It is quite a bit crazier than most interpretations. So let's dive straight into it. The year is 1926. A handful of engines roamed the Northwestern Railway. For a good while at this point, there was no official pilot engine for Knapford Station, the Northwestern's terminus. The tender engines were to shunt their own trains for the main line, and the majority of them did not like that. Tensions rose over the passing weeks, and eventually a world first would happen. Thursday, June 10th, 1926, marked the beginning of the world's first ever locomotive strike. A group of mostly tender engines formed a pack, refusing to pull their trains unless a tank engine was made station pilot at Knapford. This was basically a Civil War type of event. It was like, whose side are you on and shit. The tender engine side, commonly referred to as Team Tender, consisted of Henry, Gordon, James, Emily, 98462, 87546, and Red Dragon. The ones not on strike were simply called Team Tank, and consisted of Thomas, Edward, Molly, Bluebell, and all the other tank engines and other engines on Sodor at the time. Team Tank simply carried on their duties as per usual, while Team Tender sulked in the sheds on strike. This pretty much went on for more than 2 weeks, with most of the trains not running at all, before Sir Tom Hatt grew fed up with this and put forth a new plan. You're probably wondering, how does Percy fit into all this? Well, it's pretty simple. Tom knew a new engine would be needed solely to be station pilots in order for the strike to end, and that eventually demand would rise eventually for one to be needed. And so he figured now would be a perfect time to have Crovan's Gate Locomotive Works draw up plans for a new custom-built shunting engine. What did the works come up with? They came up with an 040 ST with design cues from many builders like Kitson, Avonside, Peckett, and more. This engine will become the railway's official 6th engine, and was named Percy. Percy will enter service in mid-July, and the strike will effectively end upon his arrival. Percy will continue as Knapford station pilot for 29 years. In 1955, Percy left to help restore Tidmouth Harbor on Thomas's branch line, while Duck took over his work. Eventually, Percy will become an official member of Thomas's branch line once the construction was finished. Over the years, Percy will go through loads of hijinks, including racing a freaking helicopter, braving floods with full passenger trains, falling off a quayside, scaring Thomas while covered in lime, getting a bike caught in his train, surviving a mine collapse and being buried under a canvas wall by an avalanche, ramming through a giant chocolate factory, getting stuck in the snow countless times, getting into countless other accidents, and so much more. If you couldn't tell already, Percy has had quite the life. And he's still around to this very day. Percy's model was originally a repainted Hornby pocket rocket model, but as I said before, that model has since been scrapped, as I prefer Percy to be a little bit smaller than Thomas. Not like absolutely microscopic compared to him, but a decently noticeable size difference. I've never liked it when they were like equal size. It just doesn't look right to me. And so I searched for a new option for Percy. For a good while, I couldn't really find anything. Eventually, I snagged a Hornby Pug from Hatton's alongside a 2P engine. The Pug arrived with the 2P, and the Pug was eventually put on the back burner while I prioritized focus on Edward and a bunch of other models I was working on at the time. I found some body shells for Edward and Percy from Pixel Crafters on Shapeways. The body shells arrived around the same time, and Percy proved a little bit difficult to start. You see, the way the Hornby Pug was assembled, the wires are all entangled into the body shell, including with the giant weight in the middle. So I either had to snip the wires and resolder them, or cut up the body. I did not have a working soldering iron at the time, so you can kind of imagine what I went with. I had to rip apart the entire pug shell with a pair of nippers, just to free the chassis. And after an insane amount of time cutting through every single bit of the body shell, the new one felt like a dream. I first did some sanding to smooth out the print lines, and then I primed the body in my usual brush-on gray acrylic. I then did another round of sanding just to make sure it was extra smooth, and then I primed it again. Following all that priming and sanding was the green paint. I painted Percy's shell alongside Edward. Following that was the cleanup in black. After the cleanup work, I then went in with the red. Following that was the gold on various parts of the body, including the dome, the water cap, and whistle. Following that, I did nothing. You see, shortly after that last progress pic, I had to travel across the country for a work obligation, and during that time, my house had to be gutted of all of its flooring and the bottom half of all of its walls for mold remediation. Right when I was almost done, a bidet hose burst on my second floor and flooded 3/4 of the second floor, and all the water rained through the ceiling, absolutely destroying them and the flooring upstairs.
I ain't gonna lie, I'm getting cooked.
Thankfully, the guest room I was already staying in my house wasn't really affected, but I had to stay in there for pretty much half the entire year before it was finished. And this guest room is only like 2/3 the size of my actual room, and the layout with the bed and everything makes the space available even smaller. So modeling was very limited. But yeah, basically for 6 months, only a quarter of my house was actually functioning. It wasn't very fun if you couldn't tell. But yeah, during all this, Percy and any other model I was working on stayed on the back burner. But Percy in particular stayed on the back burner even well after everything went back to normal. Eventually in August of this year, I went back in and added the finishing touches. The only thing missing now, after some more details were added, was the smokebox door. I wasn't able to print it myself as at the time I did not have a functioning 3D printer. But pretty much around that time, the stars aligned in my favor, and around that time I was able to get a new printer and curing station for a good deal. I printed a lot of stuff at first. This includes my prints of Bulgy, Trevor, and a couple others. They are all printed around this time. And this included Percy's smokebox door. Once the smokebox door and weights were glued to the body, I glued the body to the chassis. And after that, I gave the model a clear coat. And it was done. I am really happy with how it turned out. He just feels so right next to Thomas and all the other characters, including Toby. You heard that right. I did in fact make a model of Toby, and he will be the next model on Porterverse Workbench. So stay tuned for that around December or so. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Porterverse Workbench, and I shall see you all same time next week.